The helipad smelled of hot metal and ozone, and a pair of boots that were never meant to be there pressed against the paint line as if claiming it by habit. If you enjoy tense corporate thrillers with a human heart, stay until the end, subscribe, like, and ring the bell for more stories like this. Sloane Davenport watched the janitor's back through the glass of the service elevator as it crawled toward the rooftop. The reflection of her office lights fractured over him, a dark smudge pushing a battered mop bucket, a man in a cheap uniform who never met anyone's eye for long. For months she had reduced risk to a ledger, a grid of contingency plans and legal buffers. She had no patience for anomalies. Yet something about the way he moved across the roof made her stomach drop out. The chopper was a trophy on a pedestal. N429SD, its tail discreetly marked with the company's initials and the kind of polish that meant either careful affection or theatrical accounting. Sloane had accepted the helicopter when her father left it to the company in trust, an emblem of reach and prestige, of the skyline carved in glass and carbon. She had not expected to find ordinariness on her helipad. She had not expected to find a man sweeping the pad with a cadence that might as well have been preparing for takeoff. He was already strapped into the pilot's seat when the elevator doors sighed open. Sloane stepped out with the composure she had spent a decade cultivating, the measured heels, the quiet click of a woman who ran a corporation like a clock. The rotors hummed, low and indifferent. Around them the city breathed. A tremor of wind lifted her hair at the back of her neck. "You shouldn't be up here," she said. It wasn't a question. He looked at her then, calm, as if she had interrupted a prayer. His face had a long quiet to it, like a morning that had seen too many nights. He set the headset with a thumb, and the motion seemed too practiced for a janitor. "Contracted maintenance," he said. His voice was level, not deferential. "Gavin's boy's in the hospital. I can—" Sloane's pulse ran on protocols. Gavin, her pilot, had been a steady presence until 2 weeks ago, when his son's diagnosis had taken him off the roster. The company had issued a temporary leave form and a list of approved contractors. None of those names matched the man in front of her. "Your badge," she said. He tapped his chest pocket. The badge was a laminate, frayed at the edge. "Lost it after my shift. I have authorization from facilities." Sloane wanted to order him off the pad, to place a call that would unspool this anomaly into a neat disciplinary action. Instead, she found herself doing something she had never done, asking for the man's name. "Who are you?" "Owen Grant," he said. It was not the kind of name that invited follow-up. It was the kind that sat in a room and kept secrets. He moved the chopper with a tenderness that surprised her. Not a pilot's arrogance, but a caretaker's attention. He ran checks with his hands rather than his eyes, fingers finding switches as if they were old friends. The headset framed his pale jaw. There was a small tattoo at the base of his neck that she glimpsed only when he turned. A crescent of something, barely visible, like a memory etched under the skin. "You can't fly corporate aircraft without clearance," Sloane said. Her voice hardened. "It's liability." He met her then with a steadiness that suggested he had rehearsed this very refusal 100 times in his head. "If you want it flown off the roof, it'll fly. If you want it grounded, I'll lock it and you'll have one more equipment report to file." There was no bravado behind his words, only the blunt economy of someone who had learned to speak in actions. Sloane measured him the way a chess player measured a piece on a suddenly dangerous board. He was a risk, unexpected, unvetted. And yet, as she watched him, something else reacquainted her. The helicopter was not hers to be ornamental. It was a tool. It could rescue a negotiation. It could, if needed, be the stage for a spectacle. She had staked personal credibility on a flight to meet Kenji Ito, Tanaka's elder statesman, 2 days from now. Gavin's absence had narrowed the window of goodwill to an uncomfortable sliver. "One flight," she said finally. The words tasted of a wager. "To Kenji's Island. Then you sign every liability form we require." He inclined his head once, an economy of motion like a soldier acknowledging orders. "One flight," he echoed. She walked away with the elevator doors closing between them, and behind her the rotors lifted them both into a sky that would not accept neat plans. She did not know yet that hiring him would become an insult that turned into an improbable proposal. Later, in the privacy of her glassed-in office, Sloane sat with her hands folded over the edge of her desk and watched the city tilt beneath a thin smear of late light. The board had not yet voted on the Tanaka deal. Her father's face, in the gilded portrait over the fireplace, looked less like a man and more like the weight of expectations. Kendall Davenport had built this into an empire by being ruthlessly predictable. Sloane had grown up under a sunlight of rules: predictable growth, predictable governance, predictable risk. She liked houses of rules. They made the world legible. Her phone notified her of a message. She told herself she would call Gavin, confirm the move, dispatch the standard legal team. But the image of Owen in the pilot's seat clung to the inside of her skull, the way he adjusted the mirrors, the precise, confiding tilt of his head. She instructed her assistant to interpret the anomaly as an isolated incident. To the board she presented a calibrated report: Gavin's leave, temporary substitution, insurance coverage intact. But the questions she did not ask out loud were sharper than the ones she did. Who trained him? Where had he learned to plan and fly with that quiet accuracy? Why had he not claimed the man who spoke his name with so much hold? The next morning, Sloane ordered a simple background check. Anything that contradicted Owen Grant's laminated badge would be a problem to exploit. She did not expect to find much. The man had used a different name for maintenance logs, and the digital trail was sparse. People like Owen, who wanted to be invisible, were good at it. The search threw up one thing she had not anticipated: a file tagged in facilities' old backups, a name associated with contractor insurance claims years ago. A scanned note: O. Grant, veteran, prefers janitorial post for scheduling with daughter. Sloane's fingers hesitated above the screen. The company's HR records did not require romanticism. They required documentation. Yet the notation reminded her that the ledger missed a life. In the stairwell below the penthouse, Kendrick Shaw found her. He had the easy smile of a man who kept banked favors in his pocket. His hair was precise, his jacket immaculate. Kendrick had been with Sloane since she first took over, a shadow that smoothed edges and carried messages. He was good at appearing useful, and better at wearing his ambition like a second skin. "I heard about the helipad stunt," Kendrick said. "Who was the substitute? Gavin's kid?" Sloane did not have to be polite. Her voice, honed on conference calls and closed-door arbitration, kept its blade. "You know who was on the pad." Kendrick's face arranged itself into concern. "Security breach is a bad look," he said. "I can draft an apology memo. We can position it as a procedural failure and—" "No, we cannot let a misstep become a brand issue," Sloane said. "No memo. We need a controlled narrative." Kendrick's eyes flicked toward the file in her hand. Controlled narrative? They were both experts at rebranding risk as competence. Yet when he left, Sloane felt the old loneliness press in. She had built systems that were supposed to protect her from surprises. Instead, the surprise had a child's laughter inside it. Owen's apartment smelled like boiled rice and old books. Maya's drawings were magnets across the refrigerator, faces with oversized eyes, and sons that always smiled. He was careful with details at home, the way he was careful with machinery. Socks folded, shoes aligned, homework checked like a pre-flight checklist. His daughter had a small scar on her knee from a bicycle accident that had been, in his telling, the bravest thing she had done all week. When he watched her make leaf boats out of her lunch packet wrappers, the smile that crossed his face softened lines that had been carved by memory. Sarah's absence was a constant that he navigated with ritual. He kept one of her scarves in a box marked winter, though there would be no more winters to share. The past came into him not as a story, but as a set of reflexes. Certain songs that arrived sudden as drones in the street. A tightening of the throat when a car backfired. He had been a soldier. The world was a place of rehearsed danger. Most days he kept that trained attention locked away under a calm he wore like a jacket. Maya needed medications that were expensive and inconsistent with Owen's pay. He worked night shifts, sweeping floors and scrubbing conference rooms, because the daytime opener job was less forgiving of the unpredictability of hospital visits. The company had been a constant source of night hours and overtime. His janitorial work had become an ordinary face to a place that did extraordinary things. He liked being invisible. It kept him safe. At school pickup, Maya insisted on taking the long way home, choosing a path that wound through a small park where she could make boats and test them in a storm-drained stream. She wanted to collect leaves with odd edges and test how many folded pairs of tape would make a stronger haul. He allowed it because sometimes the slow commitment to small rituals repaired the world enough for one more day. When Sloane arranged for an unscheduled face-to-face with Kenji Ito, no one expected the elder to notice the small things. Kenji was a man who had built his trust like a garden, quietly, over decades. He had been the kind of negotiator who appreciated humility more than spectacle. Sloane had spent a week rehearsing the right speech, metrics, projections, cultural fit. Pride, she had learned, was not the same as persuasion. She would have to get under Kenji's skin with a language he understood. The island where Kenji conducted hospitality was not on any map Sloane kept. It was new garden paths and stones that had been worn by feet much older than hers. Kenji moved across it with measured attention. He watched Sloane as if reading pages. She offered him the standard material, slides, forecasts, legal structures, and he offered her a bowl of green tea with the silence of a man who had waited to speak. "You have someone who cleans your roofs," he said at last, in a voice that had been tempered by years of listening. "You value things that fly." Sloane's practiced reply was ready. "We value stewardship." Kenji considered her as if weighing that word's flavor. "People who keep the roof will not always be the ones who fly," he said. "But when a person can both keep a roof and lift something into the sky, you learn something about how you value labor." Sloane felt a small laugh arrested in her chest. The helipad felt sudden and raw in her memory. Owen's hands, the way he had arranged the headset. She had hired him by accident and protocol. Kenji's words slid past performance metrics and lodged where they hurt. "What do you want of me?" she asked. "To see how you choose," Kenji said. "To see if you can let a person give what they can and not lose the gifts that make them whole." The invitation was practical. Kenji wanted reassurance that the company's values were not merely a cover for cutthroat deals. The flight to his island had been intended as a performance of commitment. Instead, it had become a test, not just of the company, but of Sloane herself. Back in the city, Kendall's grin had a different angle. He cleared his throat and presented a document he claimed was an internal audit. "We found anomalies," he said. "Payroll mismatches, badge irregularities. It would be wise to consider an independent compliance review." Sloane watched him like a hawk watches prey. She had built a company on clarity and feared the fog. "Run your audit," she said. "Make it public." Kendrick's eyebrows rose. "Public?" "Transparency," Sloane said. "We will not hide. We will expose any rot and fix it. If we do not, we have no authority to tell others what to fix." He left with a smile that did not touch his eyes. She felt the exchange as if someone had reached into her chest and tested the elasticity of her own convictions. Meanwhile, Owen returned to his routines with a new reverence for the helicopter. He checked the map of Kenji's island with a steady hand, calibrating time with a pilot's sense of the wind that lived in concrete and sea. He did not want attention. He wanted enough money to pay for Maya's appointments and a safe place to sleep. But the secret in his bones, that he could lift a machine and take it through a storm, belonged to a part of him that had been boxed up after Sarah's death. To fly was to remember a life he had promised to forget. Before the flight, they ran sim checks. Gavin, no longer on duty but present in the briefing, gave Owen a curt nod. The pilot's boy was still in the hospital. It was a small motif that threaded them together. On the helipad, Sloane oversaw the pre-flight with the hands-on meticulousness of a CEO who could not sleep without being sure. She watched Owen strap in and feel, without admitting it, the thin needle of anxiety that gripped at the base of her skull. Over the water, the sky was honest and flat. Kenji's island rose like a careful secret. The meeting went as such meetings often did, polite, trimmed of emotion, saturated with the weight of possibility. Kenji spoke to Sloane's willingness to be both a steward and a risk-taker. His men listened. Sloane offered a pledge to establish new programs within the company, a division to identify overlooked talent and bring it into the fold. And Kenji's face softened in a way that made Sloane consider the price of a promise. On the return flight, the weather had a different idea. A bank of gray amassed like a wall. The pilot's routine that Owen carried with him tightened under the pressure of clouds. He skimmed the instrument panel with gloved fingers and felt the air press like a hand on the machine. Sloane did not like not knowing. Fear made her particular in the way she made plans. She watched Owen with a fierce, private curiosity. He flew as if he had been born in machines and trained in silence. There was no flourish. There was only the economy of a man who understood that a machine and life were equal parts fragile. When the storm hit, rain came like a tear from the sky. The chopper banked hard. For a thin expanse, Sloane saw all the things that had been forged into her, the illusion of control, the brittle measures of trust. She realized, with the clarity that danger brings, that she had made room in her world for a man she had not understood. They made it back because they were careful and precise and stubborn. The helipad looked like a small island on a rooftop when they came down, sodden and steaming. Gordon, one of the facilities chiefs, swore when he saw mud on the paint lines. Kendall, who had been circling like a vulture, had no vocabulary for the moment that had unfolded. Sloane, damp at the hairline, felt something inside her shift, not because Owen had flown the company craft, but because the simple fact of his fit in that role exposed a blind spot she had always denied. The people around her had lives and skills she had not accounted for. After the island meeting, Kenji sent a note to her office. He commended her candor and invited her to think about the company as more than a ledger. "What the city uses as tools," he wrote, "you must learn to use as voices." The note arrived as Gavin called to say his boy had stabilized. Gavin's relief had a boy's laughter in it. The office, for a moment, was a place that knew the geometry of loss and repair. But the quiet was fragile. When payroll anomalies surfaced in a routine report, small items that could be explained away by human error suddenly read like evidence to someone who wanted leverage. Kendrick had the kind of patience that waited for cracks to become canyons. He circulated a memo with the slightest hint that Sloane's leadership invited irregularities. He suggested a committee. He suggested delays. He suggested that perhaps the company's board needed a steward with a firmer hand. Sloane felt the company tighten like a fist. The board convened in an emergency meeting. The air in the conference room was cold, air-conditioned to the precision of an operating theater. Arthur, the vice chairman, sat at the head of the table with the posture of a man whose life had been measured in votes and balances. Sloane presented the evidence and the response. She did not mince words. "If we are to be the stewards Kenji expects," she said, "we will be transparent. We will open our books and our procedures to an independent review." Arthur's face read like a ledger. "Transparency can expose weakness," he said. "Shareholders will worry." "Then let them worry," Sloane replied. "They will be safer knowing the truth than living under a false certainty." Kendrick smiled thinly, and Sloane knew that an ember had been lit. The days that followed layered into one another like the thin pages of a ledger. Security pulled logs. Legal drafted responses. PR rehearsed narratives. Owen continued to clean and to fly, as needed, and returned to the apartment where Maya's leafboat flotillas awaited. He was careful to keep his world small. He refused intrusions that he did not choose. Yet he could feel the edges of his anonymity fray as the board's quiet investigation sharpened into something louder. One evening, Maya asked him why men in suits talked so much about risk. She had scraped out a boat with a tongue depressor and was coloring outside the lines. He sat beside her on the floor, the small heat of her body a counterbalance to the chill of the city. "Risk is when you put something you care about where it can be hurt," he said. Maya blanked. But doesn't risk make things exciting? It was the sort of question that wanted a child's simple wisdom. He held his breath. "Sometimes, but you don't want to put people you love where the hurt is likely." She nodded with grave concentration, as if storing the sentence for emergencies. She asked then the thing he had not expected. "Can you teach me to fly a leaf-boat to the end of the drain?" He laughed out loud, a sound that felt like a person relearning how to breathe. They made 2 boats and sent them down the gutter. They both splashed and sank and then found a tiny current that carried one of them further than the other. He pointed out the eddies and the safe channels, and she learned that even a leaf could find a route if you looked for it. The company picnic that weekend was meant to be a neutralizing ritual. Grills, name tags, careful families blurred under corporate umbrellas. Sloane walked the rows with the eyes of a leader inspecting a garden. Kenji had sent an envoy, and the Tanaka contingent had sent a quiet signal of approval by bringing a small bonsai for the company stand. For a few hours, the corporate machinery disengaged, and people were allowed to be ordinary. Kendrick wore a polo and a smile, and his politeness felt like a blade. Owen was there because event staff worked in shifts, and he happened to be on duty. He watched Maya conquer a makeshift climbing frame with the careful attention of a man mapping out the safe spots. Sloane noticed him across the space, the janitor who taught his daughter to steer leaf boats like a pilot maps air currents. She felt something in her chest that had been starved for years, the recognition that people were more than their assigned roles. Kendrick singled out the moment as an opportunity. In private, he pressed Arthur about a vote schedule and hinted at a narrative, a careless CEO who mismanaged risk. Arthur, who had lived long enough to remember that boards existed to protect capital, folded his fingers and asked questions about process. "We can't be reckless," he said. "We must be thoughtful." Sloane felt the walls around her close. She had always been comfortable in a tight chamber of certainty, but the certainty that had been her armor now felt brittle in the face of consequences. She drafted a proposal that night, a department that would identify hidden talents, a program that would invest in people who fell through the slats of usual HR filters. It would be costly, and it would be risky. It might be exactly what Kenji wanted to hear. It might also inflame a board that preferred tangible returns over social repair. Kendrick, who had made his moves with the patience of a gambler, escalated. He orchestrated a data leak. Small things, not catastrophic, but just enough to suggest negligence. A cached backup was altered, a payroll code misapplied, a badge access timestamp shifted. It read like sloppiness to an untrained eye and like sabotage to those who knew how to look. Someone on the floor found the trail and fed it to the right people. Paranoia spread like a low fog. Sloane called Owen into her office under the pretense of thanking him for the Kenji flight. She wanted to see him off the rooftop and onto a place where he would be safer. He came with his mop, with the small rituals of his life made portable, and stood in the doorway as if waiting for permission. "You're on my side?" he asked. There was no accusation in the question, only a tired curiosity. She studied him and saw for the first time the lineage of his choices: survival, care, a vigilance born of grief. She thought about Kenji's tea and his suggestion that she learn to value people like tools of trust instead of liabilities. "I want what we do to be right," she said. "I want the company to be both steady and humane." He listened and then nodded, as if to a map that fit into one pocket. "If you need someone to keep things safe in ways a board can't imagine, I can do that. But you need to be clear about who you trust." Sloane wanted to say that she trusted people by principle. Instead, she said, "I trust you to be honest." He looked at her with an expression that made the office feel porous. "Honesty," he repeated, "that's a good place to start." They left the conversation with a fragile agreement. He would continue in his role, he would fly when needed, and she would push for the human-centered program. It felt small, almost shamefully small, given the forces assembling in the wings. But it was real. In a world built on metrics, the currency of trust was thin and rare. Kendrick did not let the small agreements settle. He created a dossier of missteps and circulated it among a few allies. He planted suggestions of a competency review that would include external governance. The board responded with a call for a measured inquiry and a vote that could, in weeks, install an oversight committee with the power to stifle Sloane's autonomy. He was patient. He knew the calendar better than anyone. Owen, meanwhile, began to notice things that felt like distant echoes returning too near. He would hear a drone overhead and feel his shoulders tighten. He would wake with the taste of someone else's breath in his mouth and have to relearn the difference between being vigilant and being haunted. Maya watched him and learned to ask when the shadow passed. "Are you okay?" she would ask, simple and brave. "I'm fine," he would say, because the truth of the matter required a spiral explanation he did not have time to give. When the first full audit was released, it made a neat paper river through the board. It showed inconsistencies, highlighted anomalies, and recommended stronger controls. On paper, the company had nothing to hide. In practice, the document fed the appetite of those who wanted Sloane's seat. Kendrick presented a motion to limit unilateral executive actions during the next quarterly vote. It was procedural on its face, but the intent leaned toward more than process. It leaned toward a takeover. Sloane felt the gravity of it, as if someone had reached into her chest and tightened a strap. She moved swiftly. "We will have the independent review," she announced. "We will pause any governance redefinitions until the review concludes." Arthur folded his hands. "That is sensible," he said. Behind his eyes, the arithmetic of reputation and share value recalculated. Kendrick watched the exchange and, in the small of his smile, stored the day's currency. He would wait. He was a man who could convert a moment into a movement. Owen's world grew narrow around the edges, like a photograph clipped to fit a frame. He swept floors and flew clients and listened to staff debate where the company ought to be heading. He did not know much about board power, only enough to understand that something large was shifting. The stress that came with that knowledge did not come as an instruction, but as a pressure that pressed at the muscle.
Of his patience. Then the network alarm flashed. It was small at first, a barely audible ping in the security feed. Then a cascade of notifications, all color and anger, as IT teams tried to isolate an intrusion. Files that should have been locked suddenly showed odd access patterns. Someone had ghosted a port and moved laterally through an older cached archive. The sound of the alert had a thin, surgical quality. It was the sound of invisible hands rummaging. Sloane watched the screen from the stairwell as the security team triaged. Her instincts switched into a mode that had been drilled into her by years of living among systems. Triage the perimeter, protect the core, preserve reputational integrity. But as she looked at the logs, a human pulse interrupted the technical details. Someone had targeted the payroll anomalies specifically, pointing them toward a narrative of negligence. Kendrick's motion found new energy. Board members gathered like vultures at a carcass. The question was less about whether the company had been honest and more about who would suffer for it. The stakes were no longer about pride. They were about who controlled the narrative if accusations metastasized. Sloane felt the room contract. If she lost the vote, the reforms she had proposed would die with her authority. If she consolidated power, she risked being the ruler who used fear as mortar. She thought of Kenji's tea and the quiet grace of his garden. The world offered her a binary, and she wanted a third way. She did something reckless. She called Owen into her office again and asked him to do something she had not planned. "I need someone who understands being invisible," she told him. "Someone who can move without being seen inside the company. I need someone who will look at the servers and tell me what they know without asking for glory." He blinked. The offer lay between them, heavy and dangerous. To some it would have been an insult, to others a proposal. To Owen it was both, an invitation to step into light and a reminder of the risks light could bring. "What are you asking me to do?" he asked. "Help us find the intrusion," she said. "Help us show who planted it. Help us prove whether it's systematic sabotage." He considered the possibility, the exposure, the danger to Maya, the thin arithmetic of freedom and risk. He recalled nights with Sarah when they had learned that the world sometimes demanded action that blurred lines. He had been careful to teach Maya how to steer a leaf boat away from dangerous currents. This was not a child's stream. It was a dam. "If I help," he said, "I will need protection, and I will need your word that, whatever you find, you'll do right by it." Sloane thought of contracts and legalese and corporate protocols. And then she thought of Kenji's gaze and the difference between being a leader who claimed to care and one
who bore the consequences of that claim. "You will have my word," she said. Owen nodded. He left the office with the kind of quiet that dug down to the root of a thing. For once, the man who had been trained to be invisible felt the small thrill of being asked to be seen. The servers hummed like a heart that had learned to beat around a lesion. Owen learned the rhythm of the room, the way fluorescent lights made shadows into lanes, the quiet of racks that seemed to breathe in binary. He was not a hacker, not in the way the movies showed. He was a soldier of observation. He knew how to move without leaving fingerprints. He watched the logs with a trained patience and listened to the technicians explain the architecture in plain language. What he found was less a technical impossibility than a human cunning, a seeded trail that had the fingerprints of someone with access and motive. The intruder had used a series of misdirections that read almost like a confession. It was surgical, not chaotic, the mark of someone who wanted to rearrange blame without exposing themselves. He traced the pattern to an internal user ID that had recently been elevated. The name attached to it read like a familiar brand. It was not a random breach. It was an inside job. The discovery widened the scope of their dilemma. Inside jobs were knives that cut at the trust of a company. Exposing one meant a messy rehang of power. Owen packaged the evidence in a way that sheltered Maya's identity and leaned on Sloane's promise. He rehearsed what he would say, the way a man rehearsed a confession. When he presented it to Sloane and Arthur in a closed session, Kendrick was not present. Sloane looked at the file, at the pattern of access and intent, and felt as if a wedge had been driven under her world. The name that surfaced was precise, almost clinical. The evidence pointed to an orchestrated campaign of narrative control, something a calculated executive would do to gain leverage. Her first reaction was the sterile machinery of legal: preserve documents, chain of custody, call counsel. Her second was the more dangerous, human one: anger. She thought of Kendrick's smiling patience, his polo-clad courtesy. She thought of Kenji's quiet voice about valuing people. The evidence suggested an operative more comfortable in suits than in janitorial uniforms. Sloane asked for one thing: that they not leak this nor weaponize it until they had the incontrovertible proof they needed. She wanted to avoid a spectacle of accusation that could still be misread. Arthur agreed, but his eyes held the weariness of a man who had seen governance decisions corrode into faction. "We must be careful," he said. They moved like clockworkers against a fever. Sloane pulled support from the floor she could trust, Gavin, who had more to be grateful for than most. A mid-level
IT manager named Priya, who had the precise sort of quiet competence that loved technical riddles, and Owen, who had the advantage of being generally invisible. They planned a counter pattern, not a violent attack, but a canonical way to demonstrate the intruder's intent, a staged access that would lure the saboteur into revealing their hand. It was a gamble built on small mercies. If they were right, the saboteur would respond predictably. If they were wrong, they would simply give the saboteur a new lane. The choice felt like stepping into a darkened room and flipping a switch. The night they executed the plan, rain hammered the city in a steady sheet. The servers glowed like islands. Owen moved through the room like a man accustomed to keeping his breathing quiet. Sloane sat with her hands in her lap at a remote terminal, watching the play of data as it unfolded on the aisles of the servers. Her pulse pounded, not with fear of losing power, but with fear of losing trust. The trap worked in the way such things rarely did. Small, elegant, and merciless. The intruder bit. A user ID moved to access a flagged archive. The access generated a counterlog that traced a call back to a workstation assigned to an executive's assistant. The assistant's badge held times that did not match his presence, and a paper trail suggested manufacturing of timestamps. It read like a carefully written confession, with savings of deniability baked into the edges. Sloane felt the room tilt. The assumption she held of how power moved within her company unspooled like thread. When the name landed, it landed like a slap. Kendrick's hand, the one that had been polite and patient and every bit of ambition, was in the ledger. She did not flinch in public. She did not call for arrests with a child's shriek of triumph. Instead, she called a board meeting and laid the evidence on the table like a fact. The room was quiet enough to hear the furnace. Kendrick did not deny it at first. He smiled the smile of a man who thought small truths could be rearranged. He suggested errors, misinterpretation, a possible frame. Sloane did not let the theatrics distract her. She had watched too many cultivated lies fall apart under scrutiny. She let the documents speak. Arthur, whose instincts bent toward institutional probity, moved with a certain gravity. He watched the evidence and felt the meaning. It was not merely that someone had tried to unseat Sloane through engineered narratives. It was that the company's culture had been vulnerable to someone who had learned how to weaponize small inconsistencies. The board voted to suspend Kendrick pending an investigation. The action was not a triumphatory smite. It was the sober measure of an institution that chose to preserve integrity rather than administrative theater. In the quiet after the vote, Sloane walked out onto the helipad. The night wind lifted the edge of her collar. The city spread like a map of possibilities. She was exhausted and a little exhilarated. Owen stepped out of the elevator and joined her, holding a paper cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm. "You did the right thing," he said. There was no praise in the words, only recognition. She looked at him, at the way he had cleaned her rooftop and flown her to an island, and walked through servers like a man reading a liturgy. "You helped us keep the company honest," she said. "You helped me see value where I had been blind." He smiled, an expression that felt like a house being reoccupied. "You gave me an opportunity to be seen," he replied. "That's rare." The helipad felt suddenly like a threshold. The machine that had been a trophy felt like something that could carry responsibility. Sloane understood then that leadership was not the unchallenged spotlight she had built for herself. It was a place where decisions bore weight. In the weeks that followed, the company enacted changes. Arthur convened a committee to oversee cultural reform. Kenji's influence lent gravity to Sloane's proposal for a human-centered department, a team dedicated to finding overlooked talent and creating pathways for people who had been invisible. It was not charity, it was a business recalibration,
an admission that value sometimes hid in plain sight. Kendrick faced formal charges internally and scrutiny externally. The law moved slowly, as it does, but the board made clear its stance. Sloan, who could have used the moment to consolidate power, instead shepherded a transition plan that prioritized transparency. She did not seek to erase the wounds, she chose to expose them to air and light. Owen found himself at the center of an odd new orbit. He was offered the chance to lead the Human Potential Department on a trial basis, not as a corporate figurehead, but as a pragmatic leader who knew how to identify grit and quiet competence. The role would be a shift from mop to mentorship, from invisibility to stewardship. It was an offer that asked him to step into a public place he had avoided. He thought of Maya and of the way she had learned to steer leaf boats through storm drains. He thought of Sarah's laugh and of days when the world had felt manageable in small, precise actions. He did not leap. He paced the question as a man paces a room. Sloan, watching him consider the offer, felt a tide of something she could not quite name. It was not pity and not triumph. It was a hope that those with hidden talents could be found without being exploited. She had promised Kenji such a change. Offering Owen the role felt like honoring the promise with a person rather than a policy. He accepted with a caveat: protection for Maya, a guarantee that the department would not be window dressing, and a pledge that those recruited would be given real agency. Sloan agreed. It was
A small covenant, but the world was made of small covenants that added together. Months later, the department opened its doors, and the company changed not overnight, but in the way buildings shift after earthquakes, slowly, unevenly, but in ways that allowed for new shapes. Arthur watched with a reserved approval. Kenji visited and smiled like a gardener who had finally seen a sapling find sun. Gavin returned to the roster, his son's health stabilized. The company paid fines and rewrote policies. It was not a clean sweep, but it was not the collapse some had predicted. The final scene that stitched the threads together was not a ceremony, but a small domestic tableau. Sloan and Owen met on the helipad, not to prove anything, but to sit in the place that had once been a trophy and had become, in time, a kind of common ground. Maya was there, with a boat she had made from leaves and tape. She launched it into a puddle left by a spring rain, and watched with the same concentrated joy she had always shown. Sloan watched her and then looked at Owen. Between them lay the scaffolding of trust, promises kept, vulnerabilities acknowledged, a practical covenant to do better. Owen watched Sloan, the woman who had once been all protocol and glass, and he saw a leader becoming a steward. "Keep an eye on the boat," Sloan said, half in jest. Owen smiled. "I will," he said, like a good pilot. The three of them, small and imperfect and very human, stood on the rooftop while the city hummed below. The helicopter sat nearby. Its paint knew where rain had polished it. It was no longer an ornament. It had become, in their hands, a device for connection, a tool to cross distances. They did not pretend everything had been solved. There would be legal hearings, shareholder questions, and days when the company's old habits would press for return. But they had opened a way to repair, and such openings, once found, were hard to close. Sloan found herself thinking of her father, not as a weight, but as a cautionary tale. She would keep the metrics, but she would allow people to be more than numbers. Owen would teach people that hidden skill deserved recognition. Maya would learn that risk could be managed and kindness practiced. Kendrick's story would be a cautionary note about ambition without scruple. On the rooftop, the storm clouds that had once threatened them were passing. The city looked clean of the things that had once seemed insurmountable. Sloan extended a small, steady hand to Owen. It was not a marriage or even a public pledge. It was a promise to look after one another within the limits of their roles. Owen took her hand with the same practical gentleness he had used to guide a chopper through a storm. "We'll build something," he said. Sloan nodded. "We will," she replied. They watched Maya's boat find the edge of the puddle and glide away. It was a small thing, and yet it felt like a map forward, fragile, buoyant, and guided by hands that had learned how to steer. If there were lessons to be learned, they were simple, that institutions could be retooled to catch what they had previously let fall, that people who kept the floors and the roofs also kept the company afloat, and that a proposal that started as an insult could, with humility and courage, become a transformative offer. And somewhere below, the city hummed, ready for the next day. Thank you for reading. If this story moved you, leave a comment saying where you watched from and what hidden talent surprised you most. And if you haven't already, subscribe and ring the bell for more stories that blend suspense with heart. Night cooled the city. Lights began to stitch themselves into streets and windows, ordinary constellations that made the horizon less forbidding. Sloane lingered on the helipad long after Maya's boat had been forgotten and the child had been drawn inside by dinner and homework and the small, insistent routines of a life that mattered. Owen stayed with her until the engines were a distant memory, and then he spoke of practical things: training schedules, the first cohort of hires, a community advisory group that Kenji insisted on convening. "We'll learn as we go," Owen said. "We'll get some things wrong, but we'll fix them too." Sloane listened. The words landed differently now. They were neither armor nor excuse, but tools. When she thought of her father, she felt neither anger nor simple forgiveness, so much as an inherited chart she could redraw. She would measure outcomes, yes, but she would also measure people. She would ask questions that unsettled her old certainties. In the weeks that followed, small proofs accumulated. A woman rehired after an internal complaint led to a promotion. A mentorship pairing that kept a young technician from leaving under pressure. A board member who, after a private visit to the plant floor, began to ask different kinds of questions. Gavin walked back into an office that no longer had the same edge of danger. Kenji taught a class on ethics that surprised even him with its warmth. On a rainy afternoon months later, Maya returned to the helipad with a new fleet of paper boats. She launched them, one by one, and Sloane watched each catch the current of a gutter and find its way. It was work that had to be tended, a steady tending, nothing grander than that, and nothing smaller either. Sloane thought of covenants, how small agreements became a pattern, and how patterns made a future. She squeezed Owen's hand and let the city keep humming. The work ahead was real, and so, for the first time in a long while, so was the hope.